a guy named Thomas Paine, who was an immigrant. He actually had only lived here for about a year. He moved here from England. He writes a book called Common Sense. It's a pamphlet. It's like 60 pages. But Thomas Paine actually argues that separating from England is a good thing, right? It's actually that America will become a better place and a more a democratic place, right? Because England has a Bill of Rights. He argues against maintaining an allegiance and association with England because of their monarchy and their established monarchy is a king, right? How is a king chosen?
God.
Huh? God. By God, it's divine. They're divinely chosen, right? The idea is that this person, and then any kids they have, and then any kids that person has, they're going to rule over this country because that's the way God chose it to be, right? And people don't actually have a say. They're not the people they rule over are not citizens. They're subjects, right? They don't. If they're citizens, they have a voice in choosing their leaders. And so he says about monarchy that monarchy opens the door to the foolish, the wicked, the improper. Men who look upon themselves, born to reign, and others to obey, soon grow insolent. Selected from the rest of mankind, their minds are early poisoned by importance, and the world they act in differs so materially from the world at large that they have but little opportunity of knowing its true interests. And when they succeed in government, are frequently the most ignorant and unfit. I know, that's why I chose it. Sorry, I don't want to tell you guys, but yeah, that part. What is it? Because in monarchy, you end up in a situation where 7-year-olds become king. Right, where children or people who have severe mental and disabilities. The Common Sense is cited as one of the big arguments, like that's really well read by a lot of people. It's distributed throughout the colonies, and it's read by a lot of people. It's still very influential. And about 2 months after this thing is published, Congress asks Jefferson, like March of 1776, they ask him to write a Declaration of Independence, basically to draft some sort of declaration that they can vote on, so they can decide, whether or not we want to separate from England. And he actually brings that declaration, the finished version of it, to Congress July 2nd, 1776. So July 4th is not the day. The idea that everybody was in Philadelphia in this Continental Congress, and on July 4th they all signed it, is not really what happened. It was brought to Congress July 2nd. By August 2nd, August 8th, somewhere in early August, enough people had signed it, right? We say July 4th. A lot of historians think that July 4th is the day that we celebrate because 50 years after the Revolution in 1826. Jefferson and John Adams, who is the second president, they both die on July 4th, like within hours of each other. And so that was at the time in 1826, that was we'll get to it later, but there was a time of a lot of like patriotism and stuff, and a lot of the early histories. A lot of the stuff that we have, like the Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, or the chopping down the cherry tree, a lot of this sort of mythology, like national mythology history we have, comes from that time period, the 1820s. So that became this sort of day, the day that's marked as the 4th of July. It's kind of like a dog's birthday, Nobody really knows when the dog was born, but you're like, yeah, let's say March 15th, sure. In this declaration, the important part of it, the thing about this Declaration of Independence borrows a lot from a guy named John Locke, who's an Enlightenment thinker, right? Who wrote, John Locke actually wrote that people are entitled to life, liberty, and property, right? Jefferson changes that somewhat to say that, what does he say? All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and those include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right?
Didn't they steal that quote too from the British?
I think actually the same thinker, the same philosopher, John Locke, used that or something similar to it in something else he wrote, but not yeah. So he changes it basically. I keep trying to look for a reason, like if anyone's pinpointed why he takes property out. I would imagine that even though he owns slaves, first off, the idea that people are guaranteed the right to property, right? You're guaranteed. That's not really a political equality thing. You're talking about economics, right? You're talking about resources like land. Land is property, right? Stuff, material stuff. These guys were very affluent, and there was a lot of worry that what if we guarantee everyone property, people are going to interpret that as everyone gets land.
Well, they were smart dudes. They probably knew like not everybody would get
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah. But then, if you guarantee everybody property, and if you have lots of property, and you know there are people that don't have any property, but you say everyone's entitled to property, what happens when they say, okay, give me some of your property then? Land redistribution. That doesn't happen in this revolution, right? This is not a communist revolution. But the pursuit of happiness is an interesting concept, right? The pursuit of happiness is. Does anyone have any idea what that like? It basically means like it's like a you know what meritocracy is, or a merit-based system.
Yeah.
Right, that everyone, so not that everyone's, you're not entitled to success. You're not entitled to have stuff. You're entitled to earn that stuff, right? You're entitled to achieve as much as you can, and, you know, if you want, whatever you want to do. The idea that you don't have to remain in the same place. If you're born into poverty, you don't have to remain in poverty. Your life is not determined by what your name is, or where you're from, who your parents are, right? That it's that basically everyone is allowed to recognize their full potential. That's a complicated thing, too, when you think about it, because the guy who wrote it owns slaves, right? He owns other people who are forced to remain slaves for their entire lives, right? So it's kind of a complicated thing. He also refers to Native Americans later on in the Declaration. He refers to them as savages, because he accuses the British of having savages attack us on our frontier settlements. Jefferson's views on when it comes to Jefferson's views on like white and black people, he's very much a white supremacist. He does not believe that black people are equal. He does not believe that slaves. He doesn't believe that black and white people will ever get along. Because he thinks that, number one, that black people are inferior. He's white, that's what's called a white supremacist, right? You hear this term a lot in the news, but he was a racist. But he also knows that he recognizes that slaves are human people, and that they will never forgive white people for enslaving them. So he feels like there's this thing where he believes white people are better, but he also believes that black people will never forgive white people for slavery. So he doesn't see them ever getting along. Huh? But with Native Americans, he's got a little, it's still very, very racist, but he believes that if Native Americans eventually, if they adopt European customs as far as like property ownership and culture, and they abandon their, indigenous culture, then they're okay, they'll be citizens. He's got a very, this is a guy who's writing 250 years ago. So you sort of got a lot of these folks, like the founding fathers or the framers of our government, they shouldn't be revered as like these amazing people, because they're not. They're human beings. People, yeah. They are very fallible, right? So it's in a lot of ways what they did in the Declaration. this Declaration of Independence is very influential. It's used by so many other countries since it was written in the last 243 years. It's been used by all sorts of different, Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam used. But the thing about the Declaration, which is interesting, is it's not that, well, this guy owned slaves. He didn't really think the stuff he didn't really believe that all people are equal, but he does say it. He writes it down. That all men. Unfortunately, he leaves out like 52% of the population. But we recognize it today as being all people are created equal. Right? This is the idea that he writes down, and people signed it, and they declare that this country is established on those principles. So even if they didn't believe it themselves, even if they own slaves, it doesn't matter. This is an idea that's put out there, and it's used a lot. And the United States as a country is held to live up to that standard, right? So, and that's why if you see a lot of books on American history or in other history classes, you'll see textbooks called like American Promise or Promises to Keep. Right, this idea that there's this promise of equality, and there are moments when the United States has come through with that promise, and there's times where they've not come through with it, where they've failed, right? Where they've taken rights away from people. You can see plenty. Slavery is a good example. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is a great. You can see a lot of different examples where this idea of equality is clearly not applied to certain groups. This is about the pursuit of happiness. Equality did not mean that everyone was in fact the same, but only that ordinary people were closer in wealth and property to those above them and felt freer than common people elsewhere in the Western world, in Europe. Right? There was less inequality in America at the time, and also the idea of people being able to sort of have mobility made a little more sense. Whereas in Europe, you have a very entrenched sort of group of wealthy people and established religious, institutions, and He also says, let me see. Oh yeah, when it comes to slavery, so a lot of people point out the hypocrisy of Jefferson being a slave owner and writing this document, or being the primary author of this document. He points out that this historian's name is Gordon Wood. It is important to realize that the revolution suddenly and effectively ended the cultural climate that had allowed slavery to exist, right, without challenge. The idea that you have, when Jefferson writes this, not only are there nearly I think 700,000 slaves in America, but 2/3 of white colonists are indentured servants. You have indentured servants, you have slaves, you have all these different people who aren't really free, or they're semi-free, and then there's free people. There's all sorts of different question marks. And when after this revolution, you have this idea of equality. You have indentured servitude that basically ends, right? That system ends, and so all you're left with really is this system of slavery. Where there's this group of people that are slaves, and they exist as slaves in the world's first democratic nation. We're this democratic country of equality, and yet there's this. That's why they end up calling it the peculiar institution, because it becomes weird. It's like this weird, what do they call it? The 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's like, oh, this is America. Everyone seems really free here. This is nice. Who are those people over there? What's going on? This is kind of strange.